Hi everyone, this is take two. We're gonna be seeing if we can get Shelly on the phone. Okay. We are just waiting on Shelly to join this time. It seems she may have figured it out now. So let me just yep, it says that she's here, so let me just add Shelly. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Finally.
Finally, we figured it out. Yeah, I'm
I'm
so glad
good,
that
I'm
we were able
good.
to solve it. So how are you doing? How's your morning going so far? Well, I guess
It's going fast because I'm already in the afternoon. It's great.
it's yeah, of course. So, for those that may not know that are watching, I'm actually out of New Orleans. So we had this planned for earlier, but because a hurricane passed by and literally 90% of the city didn't have power, we had to reschedule. But I'm so glad that we're able to do this now. Today we're going to be discussing Shelley's participation in 40 Women Pulling at the Threads of Social Discourse, which is an exhibition that we just closed, unfortunately, but it was a really awesome run in collaboration with FAMA. Um, so, Shelley, we're going to just get started with the questions.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could just give everyone a little bit of background on what brought you to be a part of FAMA and what it means for you to be a member of like a women-led organization and how that came to be.
Well, I was a good friend of mine, my good artist friend Alina, Alina Rodriguez or Alina Rojo. Um, she called me and was talking to me about the Fiber Artists Association of Miami, and it sounds so interesting. And I was like, just love the concept of the show for the 19th Amendment, and was very excited. So I said, yeah, let's do it. Absolutely.
Totally. I know we talked a little bit about this earlier, but I was wondering if you could let everybody know about, your experience with textiles, how this was kind of like a whole different way of working with textiles for your specific piece and how like your background as an artist beforehand kind of informed your process for creating it.
Yeah, it when I work with materials, I work with it, as we've discussed, in more of a non-traditional manner. And I love to work with industrial materials, cement, tar, um, plaster, and I also like to work with clothing. And I did a whole series of dresses and jackets that were encaustic technique, which is taking the fabric and giving them a very sculptural, textural, physical feel. Encaustic is working with wax and oil paint together. And I would also incorporate tile, ceramic tile in these pieces. I would incorporate thin set, grout. So my association with fiber has always been about taking fiber, taking the material of fiber, and putting it in a different context, giving it a sculptural feel, putting things where they shouldn't be, taking the fiber out of context, right?
Yeah.
Like you think about tile and you think about grouting for a countertop in a kitchen. But for me, I've always loved the idea of taking things and putting them where they shouldn't be. And so now I'm sitting at my table and I'm grouting my dress with a tile in it, and it's like, okay. And I call these my frocks. They're big, like sort of like these big Victorian, type dresses that I buy at the Goodwill. So that's been my association, my experience with tile, with fiber work. So this, of course, this show with FAMA is really focusing on the traditional use of material, fiber, weaving, embroidery, that has been around for I don't know how many years, a lot. So I had to think differently about my association to fiber. I had to think about how I had to come at it at a different angle. And it was a good learning experience for me. So I gave myself a challenge to take away the cement, take away the tile, take away the grout, take away the tar, and just be much more raw and direct. Make it really about fiber. So I learned a lot from the process. But I still incorporated paint. I'm a painter, that's, where it all started for me, painting and drawing. And so those elements are still in this piece because it's part of who you are as an artist. So I had to rethink how I did it. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that's kind of like a general theme across all of the artists is that, whether they've worked with textiles for a long time, whether they've worked with it in a different fashion, or whether they take a more traditional approach, it was about not only adapting to the subject matter in a way where you're, creating different iterations of a flag and what that means to you in the context of the 19th Amendment, but also bringing your own perspective as an artist and what makes you an artist. And I think that really shows through in your piece specifically because even though it's definitely a flag, there's no denying that it's very textile based and loose. There are those structural elements in it. You have like the bras, you have the penises, the stars. It is a flag, but it also has that almost sculptural feel to it, which I think is really fascinating as well. It's like it's still Shelley, no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As Madonna said quite famously, she's made a lot of money. She's a material girl. I'm a material girl in the sense that, I just get really sucked into the juiciness of materials and how you can play with them and do stuff. And sometimes the materials can dictate what your work is about. Sometimes, well, for example, when I put the bras and panties all over the flag, my concepts start to change a bit because when I start putting the bras and panties on there for the texture, and also of course for the symbolism of bras and panties as being about women, of course, symbolic of women, I started to think that my initial concept was to do paintings of women on top of that. And then I thought, once the bras were down there, and then I start playing with, okay, what about the stripes on the flag? Let's try a stripe up here. And that was like, that's exactly what I want. So sometimes the materials, can tell you, direct you with where the work is going.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting how you're talking about the employment of different materials, kind of informing your process and informing what steps are going to be, because I think, from concept to execution, I'd say most artists can agree that like things totally take a different direction at different actually getting into it, which is part of what makes creating artwork so fun is that what you wind up with is in a totally different place than where we were beforehand. And I want to talk a little bit more, like you were saying, about the process. We saw a few photos, some really endearing photos of yourself with your family creating certain pieces within this flag, and I wanted you to talk a little bit more about like that communitarian sense of creating the piece and how that felt for you.
Well, that in and of itself was a new experience for me, and again, going back to the traditional use of materials and fabrics, and I approached it like a construction worker, so now I had to rethink that. So here's, I don't sew. And so my daughter has a sewing machine. So we put the sewing machine out and I knew what I wanted. I knew I wanted to have penises to represent each flag, 50 penises, to represent the male dominance in this country and what women have had to fight and work against or work with. So I knew I knew that I wanted those 50 penises to be made out of fabric, and I wanted them to be like a quilt. I want them to have the same reference to the softness, and I want them to be able to be movable. I want to have an element of whimsy. I want it to be whimsical. And if I wanted somebody to be able to touch them and they would go, boom, you know, stand right back up. So I knew what I wanted, but I had to think, how can I do that? You know, I can't rely on my cement. That's not going to work. So I got called, you know, a couple of people I know, and Leanne Martinez, who's an amazing woman, amazing seamstress. My partner, Sonia Regalado, who is Jill of all trades, and my daughter and her friend, who's also called Leanne. And we set up like a factory, like a little conveyor belt system going here. Leanne's mom, she worked on the Leanne are mother and daughter. She worked on sewing out my pattern. First I drew the template of the penis. Had to do a couple of them because some of them were not quite right. So Leanne's mom was there to say, no, this has got to be a little bit higher here, no, a little bit lower here. This is not quite right. So anyway, I went back and refined it, and came up with a good template. And I said, this is what I need to do. You know, I was really, what's the word, delegating the process. And so she was the sewer, and I was the stuffer, and my daughter was a stuffer and also a sewer. So we spent a whole weekend sewing and stuffing penises for like 8 hours a day. And then we had to sew them onto each star. And they had to be done properly so they wouldn't flop over. They had to be erect. You know, we wanted strong men up there, representing strong men who, you know, they're going to tell us what we need to do. So that was the process of sitting around the kitchen table. That's the photos that you saw of our quilting, Sunday afternoon quilting.
Yeah, and you know, even though it is a totally more whimsical, radical approach, I do think it kind of is almost like a microcosm to the history of quilt making and fabric making in the US and as an art form, like the communitarian sense of it, the way many people are on a project together, there's no one entity. And then beyond that, in the sense of like the whole point of this exhibition celebrating, you know, the suffragist movement and amendment, how there was no one individual that could have achieved getting to the place where women can vote. It was an effort of many different generations, many different women of many different walks of life, which I think is really, it's interesting how that was kind of like partially because of the realities of what you needed to do to make the piece, but then it's also like so meaningful.
Yes.
The greater scope of the work.
Right. It was definitely a collective effort to make those penises. After that, I was good to go. I was on my own. I was good to go then.
Of course. So, you know, you talked a little bit about the penis symbol and its, you know, its significance in your piece, which I think is one of the things that you first notice when you're looking at your flag. Can you talk a little bit more about how those penises represent like male dominance in society, and how that was the case 100 years ago, and how do you think that reflects on society today?
Well, certainly I think it does reflect on society today, to jump into that part of your question first, because when I was, you know, first talking or thinking about the concept of the 19th Amendment, the suffrage movement, and thinking about voting rights today, and the country as a whole right now, I immediately thought that 50 penises, you know, have to represent each state. And that is what, it's not just women that are up against the penis reference, you know, which reference, of course,
The patriarchy?
Yes, correct. Thank you. You know, many men are dealing with that as well. It's not just women. You know, it's just this, there's a certain mentality that men and women are both dealing with and working, trying to work with or trying to work against or trying to stand up and be stronger as people, but yet, you know, you have this suppressive male dominance, you know. But I want to make it clear, it's not all men. I mean, it's, you know, a certain culture of men that have been very suppressive.
Of course, and it's a culture that is upheld by just people in general. It's not necessarily just men, and it's not. There are, of course, women, as
Yeah.
you and I, that uphold kind of those values, and you know, and like you put so beautifully, to be in a system that is like unequal between sexes, which account for 50 and 50% of the population, it's not something that one benefits from, even though obviously in very concrete terms men have totally benefited from it. It's also something that we unilaterally all suffer from, and we all suffer the consequences from, like spanning from the expectations that a man has to have with regard to his life to the limitations that a woman has throughout her life as well. So I think you put that so beautifully in what you just said, but not only that, you've expressed it really beautifully in the employment of both female and male symbols within your piece, which I think is unique to the exhibition in general. Most of them focused on womanhood.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I want to move on a little bit more about your role within FAMA and how you and I both talked about how you're an educator in your local area. You know, you're an art teacher and how that informs your work. Can you talk a little bit more about, for everyone else, kind of like the relationship between being an educator and being an active artist?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I say to my students all this first, and I'm an educator second.
Of course.
And it's a relationship that, you know, they're joined at the hip. You know, it's an educator. Of course, our role is to educate and to inform and et cetera, et cetera. But as an artist, that's also, I believe, you know, I feel strong that that's my role too. If there's things I don't agree with, I need to speak out. And it's cathartic for me to do that in my work. And, you know, that it's often that becomes the underlying concept of, I would say, almost all of my work. You know, there's so much out there, especially right now, in 2020. There's so much to speak about. There's so much, I don't even know what to say. It's like living in a science fiction movie. There's so much chaos and craziness. And that, you know, as an artist, I think it's important that it's our voice. And we need to get that voice out there to create public awareness. And even if you don't, you know, reach, you know, 150 people or whatever. Let's say you don't reach, maybe you reach one person. That's one person that you got the message out to, and that's important.
Of course.
So I think that both are, I think an artist and a teacher are both educators, really.
Definitely. I totally agree. I think to some effect, you are implicitly being educated when you're looking at art, because you are learning about either that artist's lived experience or the things they want to talk about. And when you have a platform like yours where you're creating work that people are going to see, I think it's really valuable that you think about, well, what am I going to say? And
Right.
important to me, and what's important for people to hear about. So kudos to you for that.
Thanks.
As we talked about a little bit as well, you mentioned in your statement the National American Suffrage Association, and you've done a pretty extensive research on some of the women that went into the movement to enact the 19th Amendment. So do you want to talk a little bit about how that research went and some of the things that you learned as well?
Oh, I've learned so much from that. I mean, the whole being an artist, I mean, life is a learning process, right? It was like, was it Picasso who said, one of his last things he said is that there's so much work I didn't make. And he was the most prolific of any artist, right? If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind, I'd like to read something from my artist statement, if that's okay with you.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Because I think it's so important that these women, the pioneers, we are where we are because of these women. I want to just read a quote from Lucretia Mott, who was extremely important, strong, wonderful pioneer for the suffrage movement. Her quote, "Any great change must expect opposition because it shakes the very foundation of privilege." That is such a, that is so important. It's right. I mean, I could say that right now, you know. Women of the United States finally won the right to vote through the National American Suffrage Association in 1920. So we just had our 100-year anniversary in August. Through decades of cooperation, activism, and perseverance, women had a voice and were allowed to use it. Women artists both responded to and contributed to this divisive movement through various forms of art and writing. It gave them voice and credibility to their students, to their status as women and professionals, and their struggles to be fully acknowledged American citizens. These women challenged traditional norms and practices, demanding social and political change. And just to name a few, you got Mary Beatty, Abigail Scott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone. That's just to name a few. And what these women did to get us to where we are 100 years later is quite phenomenal. They were second-class citizens. And it's these women who stood their ground. Pardon the pun, but they stood their ground. And this flag piece really is homage. It's paying tribute to these pioneers, and the bras and the panties are symbolic of women, all these women.
Of course. So on that note, I think we're going to wrap up today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It was really a pleasure to learn about the significance of your work and how it falls within the greater discussion of the 100 years of the 19th Amendment. Do you want to share with everyone where they can find you on social media so that they can look at the rest of your work and everything you're working on next?
Sure. I just want to say, before I do that, I want to say thank you to you. I think that you made this very comfortable, and your questions were very insightful.
I appreciate it.
I'm actually going to start a new piece based on some of the questions you asked me. So
I'm excited to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, I'll let you know. Right now, I can give people my website.
Sure.
It's just ShellyMcCoy.com. Very simple. And my Instagram is Shelly McCoy, I believe.
It's Shelly McCoy Art, actually.
Thank you. See, thank you.
No worries.
Yeah.
But yes,
I'm a Crayola girl, huh?
Huh? What'd you say?
I'm a Crayola girl.
I love that. It's such a good. Everyone should be a Crayola girl.
Oh man.
But yeah, we're done with this interview for the day. Thank you everyone so much for joining and listening in on our conversation. It's really a pleasure to get so many people interested, and have an excellent day.
Thank you so much, Mario. You're wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.